Within 6 hours of Thompson's encounter with Oliver, the video had spread across the globe with the viral velocity that only authentic human moments can achieve. The hashtag Guard Oliver was trending worldwide, and the story had captured headlines from London to Tokyo, from New York to Sydney. The public response was overwhelming and immediate. Millions of people shared their own stories of times when institutions had failed them, when protocol had trumped humanity, when someone in uniform had chosen compassion over convenience. Thompson and Oliver had inadvertently created a global conversation about what it meant to serve, to lead, and to choose humanity in a world increasingly dominated by rules and regulations. But the most important response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the incident, as Thompson waited anxiously for the results of his investigation, a black car pulled up to his modest home in Surrey. 2 men in suits approached his door, and Thompson's heart sank, assuming they were there to deliver news of his discharge. Instead, they informed him that he was being summoned to meet with the Queen herself. The audience at Windsor Castle was unlike anything Thompson had experienced in his military career. He stood at attention in the same uniform he had worn that day at the palace gates, acutely aware that this might be the last time he was entitled to wear it. Queen Elizabeth II, despite her advanced age, possessed a presence that filled the room. She studied Thompson with eyes that had witnessed nearly a century of human triumph and tragedy, war and peace, tradition and change. "Lance Corporal Thompson," she began, her voice carrying the authority of decades of constitutional monarchy, "I understand you created quite a stir at my front gate." "Yes, Your Majesty. I violated protocol to help a sick child." The Queen's expression remained neutral, but Thompson caught a subtle shift in her demeanor. "Tell me about this boy." Thompson found himself describing Oliver in detail, his courage, his determination, his dream of serving as a Queen's Guard despite his terminal illness. As he spoke, he watched the Queen's face carefully, looking for any sign of how his fate would be decided. "And you felt that protocol should be abandoned for this child's wish." "Your Majesty, I felt that protocol exists to serve people, not the other way around." Oliver represented everything the Queen's Guard is supposed to protect: courage, dignity, and hope in the face of adversity. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, and Thompson could hear his own heartbeat in the silence. When she spoke again, her words changed everything. "Lance Corporal Thompson, in my 70 years as monarch, I have learned that institutions survive not by rigid adherence to rules, but by remembering why those rules exist in the first place. You reminded us that the greatest tradition of the British military is not ceremony, but service." Thompson felt his knees nearly buckle with relief, but the Queen wasn't finished. "However, your actions cannot go unaddressed. You cannot simply ignore protocol whenever your conscience dictates. Therefore, I am promoting you to corporal and assigning you to a new position. You will serve as liaison between the palace and organizations supporting terminally ill children who wish to meet the Queen's Guard." The irony was perfect and intentional. Thompson's punishment for breaking protocol was to be put in charge of ensuring that similar situations could be handled properly in the future. His career wasn't ending. It was being redirected toward the very thing that had motivated his breach of duty. But the Queen had one more surprise. "Additionally, I am personally investing Oliver Matthews as an honorary member of the Queen's Guard, with all the recognition and respect that title deserves." The ceremony took place the following week, and Oliver was strong enough to attend despite his deteriorating condition. Wearing a specially tailored Queen's Guard uniform in his exact size, he stood beside Thompson as the Queen herself presided over his induction. Oliver's face shone with joy as he received his ceremonial sword and took the oath of service. His voice was weak but clear as he promised to serve with honor, courage, and integrity. Thompson, standing at attention beside him, had never felt more proud to wear his uniform. The media coverage was extensive, but this time it was officially sanctioned and carefully managed. The palace used the opportunity to announce new programs for sick children, funded by donations that had poured in from around the world after the original video went viral. Oliver's condition worsened rapidly after the ceremony, but he spent his final weeks wearing his Queen's Guard pin and telling everyone who would listen about the day he stood guard at Buckingham Palace. He died peacefully 2 months later, surrounded by his family and holding the ceremonial sword the Queen had given him. Thompson attended the funeral in his dress uniform, representing the Queen and the entire regiment. As he placed a wreath on behalf of the royal family, he reflected on how one moment of choosing compassion over protocol had changed not just his life, but the lives of countless others. The program Thompson helped establish became a model for similar initiatives worldwide. The story of the guard who broke tradition for a sick child inspired policy changes in institutions across the globe, as organizations recognized that true service sometimes required the courage to put humanity before hierarchy. Thompson's career flourished in his new role. He helped arrange hundreds of meetings between sick children and various military units, always remembering that each child represented someone's Oliver, a person whose dreams mattered more than any regulation. Years later, when his own daughter Emma was old enough to understand, Thompson told her the story of Guard Oliver and the day her father chose love over law. Emma listened with the serious attention children reserve for the most important stories, and when he finished, she asked him a question that stayed with him forever. "Daddy, would you do it again?" Thompson thought about Oliver's courage, about the Queen's wisdom, about the thousands of children who had been helped by the program that grew from one moment of moral clarity. Every single time, sweetheart. Every single time. The legacy of that September morning lived on in ways both large and small. Every time an institution chose flexibility over rigidity, every time a person in authority remembered their humanity, every time someone chose to do what was right rather than what was expected, the spirit of Oliver Matthews and the guard who honored his dream continued to make the world a little bit better. Thompson kept a photo on his desk of himself and Oliver standing at attention together, both of them wearing the uniform they loved, both of them serving something greater than themselves. Below the photo was a simple inscription that captured the lesson of their shared moment. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is remember why you put on the uniform in the first place. The story became legend, passed down through generations of guards, officers, and ordinary people who understood that real strength isn't about following orders without question. It's about having the wisdom to know when breaking a rule serves a higher purpose than keeping it. And, in the end, that September morning proved something that Oliver had always believed but the world had sometimes forgotten. That the greatest honor any person can achieve isn't perfect adherence to protocol, but the courage to choose compassion when it matters most, regardless of the cost. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of Major Harrison, Thompson's commanding officer, accompanied by 2 palace security officials and a representative from the royal household. Thompson could see them through his peripheral vision, their faces a mixture of confusion, concern, and barely controlled anger at the breach of protocol playing out before the palace gates. Oliver sensed the change in atmosphere immediately. His small body tensed, and Thompson could see fear creeping into the boy's eyes as he realized their shared moment was about to be interrupted. The crowd, which had been respectfully silent during the impromptu ceremony, began to murmur with anxiety and protective indignation. Major Harrison's voice cut through the morning air with military precision. "Lance Corporal Thompson, return to your post immediately." Thompson felt the weight of the command like a physical blow, but he also felt something else, a clarity he had never experienced before. He looked down at Oliver, who was still standing at attention despite his obvious exhaustion and the approaching authority figures. "Guard Oliver," Thompson said quietly. "You have served with honor. Your duty is complete." Oliver's response nearly broke Thompson's heart. Despite his fear and disappointment, the boy managed a perfect salute and replied, "Thank you for serving with me, sir. It was the greatest honor of my life." As Thompson slowly returned Oliver's final salute, he became aware that their exchange had been captured by dozens of cameras and phones. The moment was already spreading across social media platforms faster than any official response could contain it. What had started as one family's desperate appeal was becoming a global phenomenon. Thompson stepped back from Oliver and turned to face Major Harrison. The older officer's face was unreadable, decades of military discipline masking whatever emotions lay beneath. But Thompson caught a fleeting glimpse of something in his superior's eyes, not just anger at the breach of protocol, but perhaps a grudging understanding of the impossible choice his subordinate had faced. "Sir, I can explain," Thompson began, but Major Harrison cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Not here," the major said tersely. "Corporal Jenkins will take your post. Report to my office immediately." As Thompson prepared to leave, Oliver suddenly called out in a voice that carried across the entire crowd. "Wait, please wait." The desperation in the boy's voice stopped everyone in their tracks. Catherine Matthews moved to her son's side, clearly torn between protecting him from further disappointment and supporting his need to speak. "I want everyone to know," Oliver said, his young voice somehow carrying the authority of someone far older, "that Guard Thompson is the bravest soldier I've ever met. He kept his promise to protect people, even when it was hard. That's what real guards do." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, and Thompson felt tears threatening for the first time since childhood. This terminally ill boy, faced with the crushing disappointment of their moment being cut short, was using his remaining strength to defend the man who had given him 3 minutes of pure happiness. Major Harrison's expression softened almost imperceptibly, but his duty remained clear. "Lance Corporal Thompson, you're relieved of duty pending investigation." Thompson nodded and began the long walk back to the palace, knowing that each step was taking him away from his post, his career, and quite possibly his future in the military. But as he walked, he became aware of something extraordinary happening behind him. The crowd wasn't dispersing. Instead, they were organizing. Someone had started chanting Oliver's name, and others were demanding that Thompson be recognized for his compassion rather than punished for his breach of protocol. Phones were buzzing with activity as people shared the story across every social media platform they could access. David Matthews, Oliver's father, had found his voice at last. "That soldier just showed my son more respect and dignity than any doctor, any official, any institution has shown him since he got sick," he declared to the growing crowd. "If doing the right thing is wrong, then I don't want to live in a world with your rules." Thompson could hear the crowd's response even as he walked away, their voices rising in support of both him and Oliver. What had started as one family's private struggle was rapidly becoming a public demand for institutional change, for recognition that compassion should triumph over protocol when human dignity was at stake. In his office, Major Harrison faced Thompson across a desk heavy with paperwork and military tradition. The older officer studied his subordinate for a long moment before speaking. "Do you understand what you've done?" Harrison asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. I broke protocol to help a dying child fulfill his final wish. You violated centuries of tradition. You ignored direct orders. You compromised the dignity of the Queen's Guard in front of international media." Thompson met his commanding officer's gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. I did all of those things. And given the chance to do it again?" Thompson thought about Oliver's face when they stood together at attention, about the pure joy in the boy's eyes, about the courage it had taken for a sick child to travel hundreds of miles chasing a dream that seemed impossible. "I would do exactly the same thing, sir." Major Harrison leaned back in his chair, and Thompson caught a glimpse of something that might have been respect flickering across the officer's features. "You realize this will mean a formal investigation. Court-martial proceedings. Possible dismissal from service." "I understand, sir. Your wife and daughter, how will you support them if you're discharged?" The question hit Thompson hard, forcing him to confront the practical consequences of his choice. Sarah was still on maternity leave, and their savings were minimal. Losing his position would mean financial hardship, the loss of their home, and an uncertain future for his family. But then he thought about Emma, his baby daughter, and what kind of world he wanted her to inherit. Did he want to raise her in a place where following rules was more important than showing mercy? Where institutional preservation mattered more than individual human dignity? "Sir, I joined the Queen's Guard to serve something greater than myself. I thought that meant following orders without question. But today I learned it means having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult." Major Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Thompson with eyes that had seen decades of military service, countless difficult decisions, and the evolution of an institution that balanced tradition with humanity. Lance Corporal Thompson, he said finally, what you did today was either the act of an insubordinate soldier who cannot follow basic orders, or the act of a man who understands the true meaning of service better than his training manual. The investigation will determine which. As Thompson left the major's office, he passed a television in the corridor showing breaking news coverage of the morning's events. The footage of him and Oliver standing together had already been viewed millions of times, and the story was spreading across international news networks with unprecedented speed. The reporter's voice followed him down the hallway. What many are calling a powerful example of humanity triumphing over protocol, as a Queen's Guard chose compassion over career to fulfill a dying child's wish. Thompson realized that regardless of the investigation's outcome, he had already achieved something far more important than career advancement or institutional approval. He had reminded the world that behind every uniform, every tradition, and every rule stood human beings capable of extraordinary kindness when they chose love over fear. The true test of his decision was yet to come, but Thompson already knew he had passed the only examination that really mattered, the one conducted by his own conscience in the quiet moments when he looked at his reflection and asked whether he had become the kind of person he wanted his daughter to admire. The first crack in Thompson's resolve came when he saw Oliver trying to stand from his wheelchair. The boy's legs were weak from months of treatment, but his determination was absolute. He gripped the armrests and pushed himself up, swaying slightly as he attempted to mirror Thompson's perfect posture. I want to stand like a Real Guard, Oliver whispered to his mother, his voice carrying just far enough for Thompson to hear. The words cut through every barrier Thompson had built around his heart during 3 years of ceremonial duty. Thompson watched as Catherine Matthews gently supported her son, tears streaming down her face as Oliver struggled to maintain the rigid bearing he had studied so carefully. The boy's miniature uniform hung even looser when he stood, but his chin was raised with fierce pride. He was determined to prove himself worthy of the soldiers he admired, even as his body betrayed the courage of his spirit. The crowd had fallen completely silent now, recognizing the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. Phones continued to record, but the earlier chatter and movement had given way to respectful attention. Even the reporters seemed to understand that they were documenting something extraordinary. Thompson's radio crackled a third time, and he could hear the impatience in the dispatcher's voice. His commanding officer was clearly growing concerned about the situation, and Thompson knew that official intervention was only minutes away. Once his superiors arrived, any chance of individual action would disappear into the machinery of institutional decision-making. The moment of truth arrived when Oliver, still swaying on unsteady legs, attempted to salute. His small hand moved slowly but deliberately to his forehead in a gesture that was textbook perfect despite his physical limitations. He held the salute with trembling determination, his eyes locked on Thompson's face with desperate hope. Thompson felt something fundamental shift inside him as he looked at that brave little boy standing at attention in his homemade uniform. Every lesson about duty, every speech about honor, every tradition about service suddenly crystallized around this single moment. This was what his uniform was supposed to represent, not rigid adherence to rules, but the courage to protect what mattered most. Without conscious thought, Thompson's hand moved to return Oliver's salute. The gesture was slight, barely perceptible to most observers, but unmistakable to those who understood military protocol. For the first time in 3 years of guard duty, Lance Corporal Thompson had acknowledged a member of the public. The crowd erupted in a cheer that echoed off the palace walls. Catherine Matthews sobbed openly as she watched her son's face light up with pure joy. Oliver held his salute even straighter, his entire being radiating the happiness of a dream finally realized. For that moment, a dying boy and a Queen's Guard stood as equals, united by mutual respect and recognition. But Thompson wasn't finished. Something about Oliver's courage demanded more than a simple acknowledgement. This boy had traveled hundreds of miles, stood despite his weakness, and saluted with the precision of a seasoned soldier. He deserved more than a gesture. He deserved to be treated as the guard he dreamed of becoming. Thompson took his first unauthorized step in 3 years of service. Then another. The crowd parted as he walked directly toward Oliver, breaking every protocol in his manual, but following a deeper code that transcended written rules. With each step, he felt the weight of tradition on his shoulders, but also the lightness of finally doing what he knew was right. When Thompson reached Oliver, he came to attention directly in front of the boy and rendered a full ceremonial salute. It was perfect in every detail, crisp, respectful, and unmistakably official. Oliver, despite his weakness, returned the salute with matching precision, his small face glowing with pride and wonder. "Guard Oliver," Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for the family to hear. "Permission to inspect your uniform, sir?" Oliver's eyes went wide with amazement. "Permission granted," he whispered back, his voice barely audible, but his words perfect. Thompson began a formal inspection, checking Oliver's buttons, adjusting his hat, and examining his posture with the same attention he would give to any member of the Queen's Guard. Oliver stood as straight as his condition would allow, beaming with pride as one of his heroes treated him as a fellow soldier. The crowd watched in mesmerized silence as Thompson conducted the inspection with complete seriousness. He wasn't condescending or playful. He was treating Oliver with the respect due to any guard undergoing review. When he finished, Thompson stepped back and nodded approvingly. "Outstanding uniform, Guard Oliver. You're ready for duty." Oliver's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Thompson felt his throat tighten at the boy's earnest promise. Here was a child facing death with more courage than most adults showed facing ordinary challenges, worried about disappointing the soldiers he admired. The honor of serving alongside such a person suddenly seemed like a privilege rather than a duty. What happened next transformed the moment from personal to eternal. Thompson made a decision that would be replayed millions of times across social media, discussed in newspapers around the world, and remembered long after both he and Oliver were gone. He stepped to Oliver's right side and assumed the position of attention, inviting the boy to stand guard alongside him. Oliver understood immediately, positioning himself as perfectly as his condition would allow. For 3 minutes, a Queen's Guard and a dying boy stood together in perfect silence, sharing the ancient duty that had called to them both. The crowd held its collective breath as they witnessed this improvised changing of the guard. Phones captured every second, but the real power of the moment transcended anything that could be recorded. 2 guards stood where protocol said only one should be, one representing centuries of tradition, the other representing the timeless courage that made such tradition worth preserving. Thompson could hear his radio buzzing urgently, but he ignored it completely. His commanding officer was undoubtedly en route, and Thompson's career was likely over, but none of that mattered compared to giving Oliver these few minutes of being exactly what he had always dreamed of becoming. As they stood together, Thompson became aware of the profound silence that had fallen over the scene. The usual sounds of London traffic seemed muted, the tourist chatter had completely stopped, and even the ever-present noise of the city seemed to pause in recognition of something sacred happening. Oliver, despite his obvious fatigue, maintained his position with extraordinary discipline. Thompson could see the boy's legs trembling with the effort of standing, but Oliver's expression remained focused and determined. He was living his dream, and nothing, not illness, not weakness, not the certainty of limited time, was going to make him waste a second of it. The 3 minutes felt both eternal and instantaneous. Thompson found himself memorizing every detail. The way Oliver's 2 large hats sat on his small head, the careful way he held his borrowed rifle, the absolute concentration on his face as he performed what he clearly considered the most important duty of his short life. When Thompson finally heard the sound of official vehicles arriving at the palace gates, he knew their shared moment was coming to an end. But he also knew that those 3 minutes had accomplished something that no amount of protocol or tradition could achieve. They had reminded everyone present of why institutions like the Queen's Guard existed in the first place. As Thompson prepared to face the consequences of his decision, he looked down at Oliver one more time. The boy was still standing at attention, still lost in the wonder of his dream realized, still radiating the pure joy of someone who had found exactly where he belonged. Thompson realized that whatever happened next, whether he faced discipline, discharge, or worse, he had just participated in the most important moment of his military career. He had served in the truest sense of the word, protecting and honoring something far more precious than any building or tradition. He had served the spirit that made all the rules and protocols worth having in the first place. The turning point came when Thompson finally saw the child clearly for the first time. A gap in the crowd revealed a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, pale and thin in his wheelchair, wearing a miniature version of the Queen's Guard uniform that his parents had somehow obtained. The red tunic hung loose on his small frame, and the toy bearskin hat perched on his head was comically large, but the boy wore it with unmistakable pride. The sight hit Thompson like a physical blow. This wasn't just any sick child. This was a boy who dreamed of being exactly what Thompson was. The carefully constructed walls of professional detachment crumbled as Thompson saw himself reflected in those eager, tired eyes. Every protocol, every rule, every tradition suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the simple human connection spanning the 30 feet between them. The boy's name, Thompson learned from overhearing conversations in the crowd, was Oliver Matthews. 7 years old, battling acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and, according to his doctors, running out of time. His final wish wasn't to meet a celebrity or visit a theme park. It was to stand guard with the Queen's soldiers, to be part of the tradition that had captured his imagination during his long hospital stays. Oliver's parents, David and Catherine Matthews, had driven overnight from their home in Newcastle. They had written letters, made phone calls, and followed every official channel in trying to arrange for their son to meet one of the Queen's Guards. The responses had been polite but firm: security protocols, insurance concerns, and the need to maintain the dignity of the position made such requests impossible to accommodate. But the Matthews family hadn't given up. Catherine had read about other terminally ill children whose communities had rallied to fulfill their final wishes, and she believed that if enough people knew about Oliver's dream, someone would find a way to make it happen. They had come to London with nothing but hope and a crowdfunding page that had raised just enough money for gas and a cheap hotel room. Thompson watched as Oliver's father knelt beside the wheelchair, speaking quietly to his son. Even from a distance, Thompson could see the boy's eyes never left the guards. Oliver was studying their posture, their bearing, the way they held their rifles. He was memorizing every detail of what he believed represented the highest honor a person could achieve. The crowd around the Matthews family had grown to over 100 people now, and the energy was shifting from sympathetic observation to active advocacy. Someone had started a petition on their phone, demanding that the palace make an exception for Oliver. Others were calling news outlets, convinced that media pressure might succeed where official channels had failed. Thompson could see his fellow guards beginning to take notice of the situation. Corporal Jenkins, stationed at the next post, caught his eye with a subtle glance that conveyed both curiosity and concern. The guards communicated through a complex system of barely perceptible signals, and Thompson could sense the questions flowing between his colleagues. What was happening? How long would this continue? Were they expected to maintain their positions indefinitely while this drama played out? A news van pulled up across from the palace, followed quickly by another. Reporters were setting up cameras, and Thompson realized that what had started as one family's private appeal was becoming a national story. The thought terrified him, not for himself, but for Oliver. The boy didn't need media attention. He needed someone to care enough to break the rules. As if reading his thoughts, Oliver suddenly looked directly at Thompson. Their eyes met across the growing crowd, and the boy raised his small hand in a hesitant wave. It was a simple gesture, innocent and hopeful, but it shattered every remaining barrier between Thompson's duty and his humanity. Thompson had been trained never to acknowledge individual members of the public, but he found himself fighting every instinct as he stared into Oliver's eager face. The boy's smile was radiant despite his obvious illness, and Thompson could see the pure joy in his eyes at the possibility that one of his heroes might actually see him. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across two different worlds, the world of protocol and tradition on one side, the world of human need and compassion on the other. Thompson felt the weight of his decision crystallizing, knowing that whatever he chose to do next would change everything. Catherine Matthews had noticed the exchange between her son and the guard. She began wheeling Oliver closer to the palace gates, hope renewed by what she interpreted as a sign of acknowledgement. The crowd parted to let them through, sensing that something significant was about to happen. As they approached, Thompson could see Oliver more clearly. The boy's uniform was handmade, probably sewn by his mother with painstaking attention to detail. The buttons were polished to mirror brightness, and, despite its loose fit, the tunic was perfectly pressed. Oliver had prepared for this moment with the same care and respect that Thompson brought to his own duties. Thompson's radio crackled softly, his commanding officer checking in on the situation. Standard protocol required him to report any unusual circumstances immediately. He was supposed to request guidance, to defer to higher authority, to let others make the decisions that might affect palace security or public relations. But, as Thompson looked at Oliver, really looked at him, he realized that some decisions couldn't be made by committee or filtered through layers of bureaucracy. Some moments demanded individual choice, personal responsibility, and the courage to act on conscience rather than convenience. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that a crucial moment was approaching. Cameras were rolling, phones were recording, and the entire scene had taken on the hushed tension of a theatrical performance. Everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the immediate moment passed. Thompson thought about all the reasons he should remain at his post. His career depended on following orders. The reputation of the Queen's Guard relied on their unwavering dedication to protocol. Centuries of tradition had created the mystique that made moments like this possible in the first place. But he also thought about Oliver, who might not live to see another birthday, whose final wish was simply to stand alongside the soldiers he admired. He thought about his own daughter, and what he would want the world to do for her if their positions were reversed. He thought about the man he wanted to be when he took off the uniform and went home to his family. The radio crackled again, more insistently this time. Thompson knew he was running out of time to make his choice. In a few minutes, his commanding officer would arrive to assess the situation personally, and any opportunity for individual action would be lost to institutional decision-making. Oliver was close enough now that Thompson could see the hope shining in his eyes, mixed with the fearful anticipation of another disappointment. The boy had probably faced more rejection in his short life than most adults ever would. Medical procedures, experimental treatments, and now this final appeal to the symbols of strength and honor he admired most. Thompson's hand tightened on his rifle as he made his decision. He thought about all the oath he had sworn when he joined the Queen's Guard. But underneath those formal commitments lay something deeper, a promise to serve something greater than himself, to embody the best qualities of the nation he represented. Sometimes, he realized, serving those ideals meant choosing compassion over protocol. Sometimes it meant recognizing that tradition was only valuable if it served humanity rather than replacing it. And sometimes it meant trusting that his superiors would understand the difference between breaking rules and breaking faith with everything the uniform was supposed to represent. Thompson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settling into his bones. Across the crowd, Oliver was waiting, his small hand still raised in hopeful greeting, his eyes bright with the possibility that his dream might actually come true. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether humanity or protocol would prevail in this small but significant test of character. In that moment, Lance Corporal William Thompson made a choice that would define not just his own future, but the way millions of people around the world would think about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of service. He chose to step forward into uncertainty rather than remain safe in tradition, trusting that sometimes the most military thing a soldier can do is remember why he became a soldier in the first place. The morning mist clung to the iron gates of Buckingham Palace as Lance Corporal William Thompson adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that week. Standing at attention in his towering bearskin hat, he embodied centuries of British military tradition. The Queen's Guard were more than soldiers. They were living statues, symbols of an unbroken chain of duty that stretched back through generations of conflict and ceremony. Thompson had been guarding the palace for 3 years now, and he knew the rules by heart. Never break formation. Never acknowledge the crowds. Never show emotion. These weren't just guidelines. They were sacred commandments that had governed the Queen's Guard since the regiment's formation in 1660. Tourists could shout, cameras could flash, children could wave, but the guards remained as immovable as the palace itself. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, the crowds were thinner than usual. The summer tourist season was winding down, and the early autumn chill kept many visitors away. Thompson appreciated these quieter moments. They gave him time to think about his life outside the ceremonial uniform, his wife Sarah, their newborn daughter Emma, and the small cottage they were saving for in the countryside. As he stood at his post near the palace gates, Thompson noticed a commotion developing across the street. A small group had gathered, their voices carrying on the morning air. Unlike the usual tourist chatter, there was something different about this gathering, something more urgent, more desperate. Through his peripheral vision, he could see a woman kneeling beside a wheelchair, speaking in hushed but animated tones to someone he couldn't quite see. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, with tired eyes and clothes that suggested she had traveled far. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands moved constantly as she spoke. Gestures that Thompson recognized from his own mother when she was trying to stay strong in difficult moments. Beside her stood a man who was clearly struggling to maintain his composure, his jaw tight, and his eyes fixed on the palace gates with an intensity that spoke of desperation. As the morning progressed, more people began to notice the small family. Passers-by stopped to listen to their story, and Thompson could see phones being raised as tourists began recording whatever was unfolding. The crowd grew slowly but steadily, drawn by the magnetic pull of human drama playing out in the shadow of royal grandeur. Thompson's training had prepared him for many things: hostile crowds, security threats, even the occasional streaker, but it hadn't prepared him for the growing knot in his stomach as he watched this family's quiet desperation. Every instinct told him to maintain his position, to keep his eyes forward and his expression neutral. The weight of tradition pressed down on him like his heavy bearskin hat, reminding him that hundreds of guardsmen before him had faced similar moments and chosen duty over curiosity. But something about this situation felt different. The crowd wasn't there for entertainment or photos. They weren't treating this like a tourist attraction. Instead, Thompson sensed a collective holding of breath, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something important, something that demanded respect rather than spectacle. The woman's voice carried more clearly now as the morning traffic died down. She was speaking about her son, about a wish, about hope slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. Thompson couldn't make out all the words, but he caught fragments that painted a picture he wished he couldn't understand. Terminal illness. Final wishes. Time running out. His own daughter's face flashed through his mind. Emma, barely 6 months old, with her mother's gentle eyes and his stubborn chin. The thought of her facing what this family was enduring made his chest tight beneath his ceremonial uniform. For the first time in 3 years of guard duty, Thompson felt his professional composure wavering. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard. Thompson's replacement wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, and the family showed no signs of leaving. If anything, their presence seemed to be growing stronger, more determined. Other tourists were beginning to ask questions, to learn their story, to offer support in whatever small ways they could. Thompson noticed an older gentleman approach the family with a bouquet of flowers purchased from a nearby vendor. The gesture was simple but profound, a stranger offering beauty to a family facing darkness. The woman accepted the flowers with tears in her eyes, and Thompson watched as she carefully placed them in the lap of the wheelchair's occupant, still hidden from his direct view. A group of teenagers had gathered as well, their initial curiosity giving way to something deeper as they learned what was happening. Thompson watched as they pooled their pocket money to buy hot drinks for the family from a nearby coffee cart. These small acts of kindness were creating ripples through the crowd, transforming a random gathering into something that resembled a community. The palace guards were trained to be aware of everything happening around them while appearing to notice nothing. Thompson's eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, but his peripheral vision captured every detail of the unfolding drama. He saw the way the man, clearly the boy's father, kept checking his watch, as if time itself was their enemy. He noticed how the woman, the mother, never stopped touching the wheelchair's occupant, her hand constantly resting on what Thompson assumed was her child's shoulder or arm. As the crowd continued to grow, Thompson became aware that phones were being raised with increasing frequency. This wasn't just a family's private moment anymore. It was becoming a public phenomenon. Videos were being recorded, posts were being shared, and Thompson could almost feel the invisible waves of social media beginning to carry this story beyond the palace gates and into the wider world. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a man whose job it was to be seen but not to see, was perfectly positioned to witness what might become a defining moment. The Queen's Guard were meant to be part of the backdrop of royal life, silent sentinels who observed history without participating in it. Yet here he stood, closer to this unfolding human drama than anyone else in uniform, and bound by tradition to remain as uninvolved as a statue. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness. Thompson's legs, accustomed to hours of standing, began to ache in a new way, not from physical strain but from the emotional weight of bearing witness to hope and desperation playing out just yards away. Every training exercise, every drill, every lecture about maintaining composure seemed insignificant compared to the real-world test of humanity he was facing. A palace official emerged from the main building and began walking toward the gates. Thompson recognized him as one of the senior administrative staff, a man whose job it was to manage exactly these kinds of situations. The official's approach caused a stir in the crowd, and Thompson watched as hope flickered across the faces of the family members he could see. But as the official spoke quietly with the family, Thompson could see the conversation wasn't going as hoped. The man's posture remained formal, his gestures polite, but final. Whatever he was saying, it was clearly not the answer the family wanted to hear. Thompson watched as the father's shoulders slumped and the mother's hand moved to cover her face. The crowd began to murmur with disappointment and frustration. Voices rose as people who had become invested in this family's story demanded to know why their simple request, whatever it was, couldn't be accommodated. The palace official, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention, retreated back toward the building after a few more quiet words with the family. Thompson felt something shifting inside him as he watched the family's hope crumble. 3 years of training, centuries of tradition, and the weight of institutional expectation pressed against something far more fundamental, his own sense of right and wrong. He thought about his daughter again, about the world he wanted her to grow up in, about the kind of man he wanted to be when she was old enough to understand what her father did for a living. The crowd was growing restless now, their initial sympathy transforming into indignation. Social media was amplifying their voices, and Thompson could sense that this moment was becoming something larger than any of them had anticipated. The family's private tragedy was becoming a public catalyst, a focal point for questions about compassion, tradition, and the human cost of institutional inflexibility. As the morning wore on, Thompson realized he was facing a choice that would define not just his career, but his character. The weight of tradition pulled him in one direction, while the weight of conscience pulled him in another. Standing there in his ceremonial uniform, representing centuries of British military honor, he began to understand that sometimes the most honorable thing a soldier can do is choose humanity over protocol. Sometimes the most powerful acts of humanity happen when we choose compassion over protocol. In a world where tradition often trumps tenderness, where duty can overshadow the heart, one man's decision to break centuries of royal protocol for a dying child would touch millions of lives across the globe. This is not just a story about rules being bent. It's about the moment when a uniformed guardian became a symbol of hope, reminding us all that behind every ceremonial position stands a human being capable of extraordinary kindness. What you're about to discover is how a single gesture, lasting barely 3 minutes, sparked a worldwide conversation about what truly matters when faced with a child's final wish. This is the true story of Lance Corporal William Thompson, the Queen's Guard who chose love over tradition, and The little boy whose courage would inspire a movement that reached far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace.